which reminds me, I haven't talked about this yet, but recently in London, Roger Waters and I appeared at a fundraiser for a major Palestinian charity. And, one day when there's time, I'll get into it. It doesn't really matter right now because there's so much going on. But before the event, there was a huge pressure campaign on the organizers to cancel both Roger and I. Why? Because we're critical of the dirty war in Syria. And ironically, the people behind this pressure campaign, and which was heavy, like they're trying to pressure people who are volunteer organizers of a charity event. So already all the things you have to deal with to put on a charity event. Now you have to deal with a pressure campaign to cancel two of your speakers and performers, including Roger Waters, like this, like very like one of the most famous musicians in the world. The people behind this, they call themselves like intersectional Syria, right? But what they didn't disclose is that they're literally intersectional with Israel lobbyists, that like some of them literally serve on groups that have Israel lobbyists on their board. So people who are intersectional with Israel lobbyists are trying to tell Palestinians who they can't and cannot platform to raise money for their charity. And of course, it failed and it didn't work, but it was like a big headache because you know how these pressure campaigns work, all the false claims about me and Roger, and just all the sleazy tactics of like, threatening and just pressure. It didn't work, but Syria regime change people are still so bitter about the fact that they, along with Israel and the US and their allies, didn't succeed in overthrowing Syria, that they want to basically still punish people who didn't go along with their agenda. So that was just something I had to deal with recently, and they're still active.
I mean, since you brought it up, I think we should briefly kind of nail it down and explain it to people. You were going to do a fundraiser for a Palestinian human rights group called Al-Haq, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you and Roger Waters would have been the most high profile people at this fundraiser. And it's all about Palestine and raising money.
Roger would have been like
Roger, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, he's
Roger. Yeah.
A rock legend and just legendary human rights advocate.
Yeah.
And so you would want to, if you care about Palestine, transcend whatever differences were had over Syria in order to raise money for this human rights group and just leave it alone.
Yeah.
But you had some of them were Syrian Americans and others were just like neocon trolls. They got together, and I'll talk about who they are quickly. They slapped a statement together with Ukrainians who included people from U.S. government-funded pro-war think tanks that won a nuclear war with Russia, based in Washington.
Yeah,
and so-called Uyghurs from the Turkic Muslim minority, mostly based in Xinjiang in China, who are actually propped up and supported by CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, who want a new Cold War with China and want to see a military buildup all across the Pacific Rim of Asia. So they got together with these pro-war forces in order to cancel a Palestine-related event. And they tried to get all the speakers to pull out by pressuring them because you exposed the white helmets, you exposed the Duma deception and so on. And because Roger called it out too, because Roger's actually anti-war. He's not Bono. And they failed. They failed because we're in a different era now. I mean, I would not have been able to speak in Istanbul at a major conference. There were Islamist speakers there for sure. And there were also, anti-imperialist speakers. If we were not in a new era right now, when people are trying to unite because they see what the real problem is that is holding back progress in the Middle East and taking the world to war. The problem is Zionism. And so there's a spirit of unity, and these people are trying to disrupt it. So who organized it? It was this malicious, insidious campaign. It was the Syrian Emergency Task Force, which is run by a U.S. government spook named Moaz Mustafa, who is the guy who took John McCain on his illegal trip into Syria in 2013, where he met with actual sectarian kidnappers who were being sponsored by the CIA from the Free Syrian Army. And Moaz Mustafa has been at the leading edge of the regime change plot in Syria, the dirty war. He's the guy who brought this shady Caesar character to Washington to rustle up the most crushing, brutal sanctions on Syria, which have forced like 90% of the population below the poverty line, which are starving Syrians, depriving them of any connection to the global economy, regardless of their political views. And one of his lackeys kind of led this campaign, and they are funded by the US government. They're funded by the State Department. So you were actually under attack by cutouts of the US State Department for trying to speak at a Palestine human rights group's fundraiser. It should be pretty cut and dry to people. And I think people saw through it. And so it's time to look back on that whole dark period where everyone was so divided over Syria and see who was really behind it. It's people who are spooks, who are literal spooks, who are sponsored by the US government and are acting on behalf of Israel. And as you pointed out, Aaron, Syrian Emergency Task Force on its board has someone named Toby Dershowitz, who is a staffer at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, one of the most extreme Zionist think tanks in Washington, which is dead set on war with Iran. That's an advisor to them.
Yeah, and according to that censored Al Jazeera documentary, The Lobby, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies is like literally an Israeli government front group. They
like a Mossad front group.
Yeah. So that's who was trying to cancel me, is people who literally have Israel apologists and lobbyists on their advisory board. Another friend of the Syrian Emergency Task Force is Stephen Rapp, is that his name? The former State Department official who submitted an advisory opinion to the International Criminal Court about why he thinks the court does not have jurisdiction to basically weigh in on the illegality of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. So these are the kind of people that the Syrian Emergency Task Force is working with while trying to lecture Palestinians about who they can platform or not, and trying to pressure them to drop someone like Roger Waters, who's one of the most vocal champions of Palestinian rights in the world. And it failed because people saw through it. But it was still, it did work on one person, actually, I should say. One person dropped out of the event. That was Owen Jones, a columnist for the Guardian.
Of course.
He dropped out of the event. But aside from that, it was a great success. And of course, this is not to say that I should say this, and this does not mean that everybody involved with Al-Haq endorses my views at the reporting I've done. It's not about that. This is just about not accepting a censorship campaign against people who are trying to unite around Palestine, which is the most important moral issue of our time. And the people who don't apparently agree with that are people who partnered with Israel in a failed attempt to overthrow the government, but still left the country in ruins.
Yeah. And just for the record, here's Muaz Mustafa to the left, director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force. And just to his left, or to our right, is Mike Pompeo, Christian Zionist, former CIA director.
Pre-Ozempic Mike Pompeo.
Pre-Ozempic. And Joe Wilson, Representative Joe Wilson, is one of the most fanatically militaristic members of Congress. Yeah. So these are like, the Arabs that they love in Washington. And I guess they failed to shut you down. Along with that nut job, Idris Ahmad, whose think tank New Lines is funded by the US Pentagon, who, tries to shut down, like 7-Eleven when I go to buy like a tuna sandwich. Not that I recommend anyone eat a tuna sandwich from 7-Eleven, but
yeah. Well,
they're failing now because we're in just a different era. And I think people see it clearly now.